She was only 15 when her life changed forever. In a small, sun-bleached village where dreams rarely reached beyond the dusty fields, she grew up believing that kindness and hard work would protect her. Her laughter once echoed through the narrow alleys, barefoot on warm earth, hair tangled in the wind. But that laughter was silenced the day her parents made a decision that wasn't hers to make. It began with whispers at the market, quiet voices saying her family owed too much, that her father couldn't pay back what he had borrowed. One morning, her mother avoided her eyes and spoke softly about a man who could help. The girl didn't understand at first. How could an old man's help come with a wedding dress? She thought it was a joke, until her mother's hand started trembling. The man they spoke of was older than her father, a farmer with deep lines carved into his face, eyes like cold river stones. He had land money and the kind of power her family lacked. When he came to their home, his voice filled the room like smoke, leaving no air for her to breathe. He smiled, and everyone around her bowed their heads. That was the moment she realized her life was no longer her own. On the day of the wedding, the sun burned mercilessly. Her dress was borrowed, slightly torn at the hem, and her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Villagers watched in silence, some with pity, others with envy, as she stood beside a man who could have been her grandfather. Her father's eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Her mother cried quietly, the sound barely louder than the wind. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. In her world, girls didn't run, they obeyed. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, she found herself sitting in a cart, her small hands gripping the wooden edge. The man sat beside her, unmoving, his presence heavy like a shadow she couldn't escape. The road ahead was long and empty, stretching toward a future she couldn't imagine. Every creak of the wheels echoed inside her, a slow, aching reminder of the childhood she left behind that morning. The days after her wedding passed slowly, like time itself had forgotten to move. Each morning she woke to the sound of chickens outside, the sun already spilling through the thin curtains, and the smell of dry earth filling the room. The bed felt too big, the silence too heavy. She was now a wife, but she felt more like a prisoner. The man she had been forced to marry, her husband, barely spoke to her. His face was lined, his hair turning white at the temples, his hands rough and cracked from years of work. He looked more like a father than a partner, and every glance from him reminded her of how wrong everything was. She tried to remember the last time she had felt free. Maybe it was the morning she ran through the fields before the wedding, her heart full of fear and wind. That freedom was gone now. The house was large but cold, built of thick walls that muffled even her thoughts. She learned to move quietly, to do what was expected, cook, clean, keep her eyes down. The man's footsteps were slow but heavy. When he spoke, it was with the tone of someone used to being obeyed. He didn't hit her. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Every word from him carried the weight of ownership, a reminder that she was no longer herself. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing at every creak of the floorboards. Sometimes she would whisper her mother's name, hoping it might bring her comfort. But even that felt like a sin in this new life. The neighbors watched her carefully. In that village, everyone knew everything. When she went to fetch water, the older women smiled with pity. The younger ones avoided her. She was a story now, a warning. They whispered that she was lucky, that she had food and a home, that her husband was a good man. But they didn't see the emptiness she lived with. They didn't feel the cold eyes that followed her every move. She missed her father, even though he was the one who gave her away. She wanted to ask him why her, why now, why like this, but letters weren't written in her world. A girl's voice ended where her father's decisions began. Sometimes she wandered outside when her husband was gone, walking down to the fields. The wind there was softer, almost kind. She'd kneel in the dirt, run her hands over the soil, and remember her childhood dreams of learning, of reading, of someday leaving the village. She used to imagine being a teacher, standing in front of a classroom full of small faces, showing them that life could be bigger than this. Now she was the lesson, not the teacher. Weeks turned into months. Her body began to change, small signs that frightened her: nausea in the mornings, a strange heaviness in her belly. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down she knew. She was carrying a child. The news spread quickly, like wildfire through dry grass. People congratulated her husband in the market, clapping him on the back, calling him blessed. No one congratulated her. They didn't even look at her face. The pregnancy made her world even smaller. Her husband became strangely proud, as if the child would erase the shame of their age gap. He began to show her off, inviting neighbors over, talking loudly about the baby that would carry his name. She smiled when he wanted her to, nodded when required. Inside, she felt hollow. As her belly grew, so did her fear. She didn't know how to be a mother. She barely knew how to be herself. The nights were long, filled with the sound of wind scraping against the wooden walls, and she would imagine a different life. One where she was still a girl, still free, still running through the fields barefoot. One evening, as she sat outside under the fading light, she saw a group of girls from the village walking home from the small school near the edge of town. Their laughter floated through the air like music, sharp and alive. She felt something deep in her chest, not just sadness but anger. Not wild, burning anger, but a quiet, deep one that refused to fade. Her husband came out moments later, standing beside her. "You'll have a boy," he said proudly without looking at her. She didn't answer. She just stared at the path where the girls had walked, their laughter still echoing faintly in her ears. Every day after that, she found herself waiting by the window when the children passed by. It was her only connection to the world beyond these walls, a reminder that somewhere, life was still moving. She wondered what her child would become, what kind of world it would grow into. She prayed it wouldn't be one where freedom was traded like cattle, where girls were silenced before they ever learned to speak. The house grew quieter as her due date drew near. Her husband worked longer hours in the fields, preparing for the baby's arrival. She was left alone most days, her thoughts echoing through the empty rooms. Sometimes she spoke to the child inside her, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "You will not live like me," she said softly. "You will see the world. You will choose." The night before her labor began, rain fell for the first time in months. The roof leaked in small places, drops tapping softly onto the floor. She sat awake, listening to the rhythm, her hands on her belly. For the first time in a long while, she felt calm. The rain, the sound, the smell of wet earth, it was like a memory of freedom returning to her for a moment. When dawn came, the pain started. It came in waves, sharp and relentless. She called out, but no one heard her at first. Her husband arrived hours later, panic on his face. The midwife came soon after, her hands quick and sure. The room filled with sweat, with cries, with the storm of life beginning again. And somewhere between the pain and the fear, between the thunder outside and the voices inside, something shifted. The girl who had been forced, silenced, and forgotten felt a flicker of strength rise within her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was bringing life into the world, and with it, the faint possibility of change. The cries of her newborn filled the room, small and trembling, echoing through the still air like a fragile promise. She held the baby against her chest, her hands shaking, her body weak but alive. The midwife smiled faintly, murmuring something about blessings, then quietly gathered her things and left. The house fell silent again, except for the baby's breathing, soft, steady, and new. The man stood near the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor. He said nothing for a long time, just watched. Then in a low voice he said, "It's a girl." There was no joy in his tone, no celebration. He turned away, muttering about rest, about fate, about disappointment, and walked out into the yard. She stared at the small face in her arms. The baby's eyes were still closed, her lips parted slightly as she dreamed, unaware of the world she had been born into. For a moment, the young mother forgot the pain, the fear, the silence of her husband's voice. In that moment, she felt something she hadn't known: she was capable of strength, the kind that grows quietly in the cracks of a broken heart. She whispered the name she had chosen long before the birth. Amina, she said softly. It meant peace. Days turned into weeks and Amina grew fast. Her tiny hands clutched at everything, her mother's finger, her dress, even her hair, as if she already understood what it meant to hold on. The old man rarely touched the child. He would glance at her in passing, grumbling about how a girl wouldn't help in the fields or carry on his name. Still, he provided food, medicine, and a roof. He thought that was enough, but the young mother knew it wasn't. She knew a child needed more than survival. She needed a chance. Every morning when her husband left for the fields, she would take Amina outside. They would sit under the tree behind the house where the breeze was cool and the birds sang softly. She'd hum old songs her mother used to sing, stories of women who loved, lost, and found their way again. Sometimes she spoke aloud, not to the baby but to herself. "You will not live like me," she whispered. "You will not be afraid." But fear didn't leave easily. It clung to her like a shadow. Whenever her husband's footsteps approached, her body tensed. When he spoke, she measured every word before replying. He wasn't cruel in the way of shouting or striking. His cruelty was quieter, the kind that lived in the pauses, in the unspoken rules that chained her. He decided everything, what she ate, where she went, what she wore. Even her silence belonged to him. One afternoon, while fetching water from the well, she met a girl from the next village. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, yet she carried the same tired eyes she saw in her own reflection. They began to talk in whispers while filling their buckets, careful not to draw attention. The girl said she had been promised to a man her father's age. The wedding was in a month. Her voice broke as she spoke, and the young mother felt something inside her stir, anger, fierce and unfamiliar. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the girl's voice, trembling, afraid. The next morning she gathered her courage and went to the village elder's house. Her hands shook as she knocked on the door. The elder's wife opened it, surprised to see her there alone. When she asked what brought her, the young mother hesitated, her heart pounding. "There's a child," she said quietly. "She's being married. She doesn't want to go." The woman frowned, her expression unreadable. "That is not your concern," she said softly. "Go home." The rejection stung, but it didn't silence her. She couldn't stop thinking about that girl, about herself, about the hundreds of others who had no voice, no choice. Each thought fed the flame inside her, small but growing. Days later, she overheard her husband talking to one of the village men about arranging a marriage for a neighbor's daughter. He laughed as he spoke, his tone casual, like he was trading cattle. Something in her broke. That night, after he fell asleep, she held Amina close and cried silently. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she whispered into the dark. The next week she began to speak to other women, at the well, in the fields, quietly, carefully. She asked them how they felt about their daughters, about what had been taken from them. At first they were afraid to answer. Then slowly they began to share. Each story was the same, pain hidden beneath acceptance, grief dressed as duty. Together their whispers became heavier, sharper, more alive. Her husband noticed the change. He watched her more closely, questioned her when she left the house. "Who are you talking to?" he asked one evening. She lied and said no one, but he didn't believe her. That night he warned her. "Don't forget who you are," he said. "Don't forget who you belong to." The next day she didn't go to the well. She stayed home, quiet, obedient, waiting for the storm to pass. But as the sun went down, she saw the other women walking toward her house. There were 5 of them carrying baskets, pretending to bring gifts for the baby. When they came inside, they sat in silence for a long time. Then one of them spoke. "We want to help the girl," she said. The young mother nodded. No more words were needed. That night, while the men gathered at the far end of the village for a meeting, the women acted. They went to the girl's home and took her away before the wedding could happen. They hid her in a nearby town with a family willing to protect her. The next morning, when her husband heard the news, he stormed into the house, furious. "What have you done?" he shouted. His voice shook the walls, his rage thick in the air. She stood her ground for the first time. Her heart pounded, but her voice didn't tremble. "I did what was right," she said. He raised his hand but then stopped. Something in her eyes, something fierce, something unbreakable made him hesitate. He left the house without another word. She stood there, shaking, holding Amina in her arms. The silence that followed felt different this time, not empty, powerful. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. And though she didn't know what would come next, she knew one thing with certainty. She would never bow her head again. The days after that night felt both longer and lighter. The air around her house changed, filled with something strange, fear and freedom mixed together. The villagers whispered again, but this time, the whispers carried her name differently. Some said she was brave, others said she was foolish. Her husband didn't speak to her for days, barely looked at her. He moved around the house like a storm that refused to break. Yet even in silence, she could feel the weight of what she had done pressing against her chest, not regret, but realization. She had crossed a line that women in her world were never meant to cross. Each morning she still did her chores, fed the chickens, fetched water and cooked. But there was something new in the way she moved, a quiet strength that couldn't be unseen. She no longer kept her eyes fixed on the ground. When she passed other women, they looked at her differently too. Some smiled faintly, some nodded. She didn't say anything to them, but they all understood what that nod meant. We can fight back, even if just a little. Her husband's anger simmered beneath the surface. One evening, he came home earlier than usual. The sun had barely dipped below the hills and his boots were heavy with dust. He dropped his hat on the table and stared at her. "You made me look weak," he said, his voice low and hard. "The men are talking." She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "Do you think you can live in this house after shaming me?" Her pulse quickened, but she didn't step back. "I did what was right," she said quietly. He stared at her for a long time before turning away. "There is no right for women," he muttered, walking out. The door slammed behind him and the echo lingered in the air long after he was gone. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside made her flinch, the wind, the creak of the fence, the bark of a dog in the distance. But she also felt something stronger than fear, the sense that she had started something she couldn't stop. The next morning, when she went to the well, the same women she had helped whispered again. One of them told her that the girl, the one they had saved, was safe. She had found shelter in another town, working for a family that treated her kindly. Hearing that, she felt her chest tighten with relief. For the first time in years, her actions had made a difference. Weeks passed, and slowly, the tension in her home began to shift. Her husband spoke less, worked longer hours, and avoided her gaze. The silence between them was no longer made of fear, it was distance, the kind that grows when two lives move in opposite directions. He still believed he owned her, but she had already freed herself in ways he couldn't see. Amina was now nearly 2 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn stare, though softer, innocent. The girl toddled around the small yard, her laughter breaking through the heaviness that always seemed to linger. When her mother watched her play, something inside her healed a little more. Amina didn't know what her birth had cost, or what her mother had endured, but her presence was proof that beauty could survive even in a cruel world. The young mother began spending more time outside the house, helping other women quietly. She visited widows, taught girls to read a few words she still remembered from school, and told stories to the younger ones about courage. Never using her own name, but everyone knew who the stories were about. The more she spoke, the more she realized her voice had power. It wasn't loud, but it carried truth, and truth was something their world wasn't used to hearing from women. One evening, as she was telling a story to a group of girls by the well, she saw a stranger approach from the path that led to the fields. It was a woman, tall and graceful, dressed differently from the rest. The woman introduced herself as a teacher from a nearby town. She had heard about what had happened, the girl who had been rescued, the whispers of rebellion, the quiet movement among women. She asked to speak privately. They sat under the same tree where she used to sing to her baby. The teacher spoke of a small school being built beyond the next village, a place where girls could learn, even those who had been married too young or widowed too early. She said they needed someone to help teach them basic things, reading, writing, simple arithmetic. Someone the girls will trust, she said softly. Her heart began to race. The thought felt impossible and yet right. She had never imagined herself teaching again, but the idea planted itself deep inside her, like a seed waiting for rain. When she told her husband that night, his reaction was as expected. "You will not go," he said sharply. "A wife's place is here." She didn't argue. She only nodded and said, "I understand." But inside, she knew she would go anyway. A few days later, before sunrise, she packed a small bag, a shawl, a little food, and a piece of cloth she had sewn with her daughter's name embroidered in tiny crooked letters. She kissed Amina's forehead as she slept, her small hands curled near her face. She whispered, "I'll come back for you." Her voice broke on the last word, but she didn't stop. She walked to the door, pausing one last time before stepping into the cool morning air. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet. Each step felt heavier than the last, but her heart pushed her forward. She didn't look back. The sun began to rise, painting the fields gold, and for the first time since her wedding, she felt like she was walking toward her own life. When she reached the school, the teacher greeted her with open arms. The building was small, made of wood and clay, with a roof that leaked and benches that creaked. But inside, it was alive with the sound of young voices, laughter, curiosity, hope. The first time she stood in front of the children, chalk trembling in her hand, she felt tears fill her eyes. She wrote the first letter slowly on the rough board, the same letter that began her daughter's name. The girls repeated after her, their voices uncertain but bright. In that sound, she found healing. She realized that what had begun as her own pain had turned into something much larger, a quiet revolution carried on the breath of every child who dared to speak. And though she still woke at night sometimes, thinking of Amina and the home she left behind, she knew she had chosen the only path that could ever lead them both toward freedom. The first few months at the small school were harder than she imagined. The days began before sunrise, when the fields were still dark and the air was thick with mist. She would walk barefoot along the dirt road, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, carrying a small cloth bag filled with chalk, worn books, and a few biscuits she saved for lunch. The school stood on the edge of the village, a single-room building with walls made of clay and straw, and a roof that creaked whenever the wind blew. It wasn't much, but inside it she felt free. The children came slowly at first, shy, uncertain. Most were girls, their heads covered with scarves, their eyes downcast. Some were younger than 10, others already in their teens, but all of them carried the same kind of quiet fear she once had. Many of them had been told that learning was useless for girls, that a woman's only purpose was to serve her husband and family. But the moment they sat down on the hard benches and she smiled at them, something changed in their faces. Curiosity flickered like the first spark of fire in cold air. She started with simple lessons, letters, numbers, the rhythm of words. Her voice was gentle but steady. When they made mistakes, she didn't scold them, she encouraged them. "It's all right," she'd say softly. "Try again." Slowly, the room filled with sound, chalk scratching, pencils tapping, soft giggles. It was a sound she had never known she loved so much. Every word they learned, every number they counted, felt like a small rebellion against everything the world had told them they couldn't be. But not everyone was happy about the school. Some men from nearby villages began to talk. They said teaching girls was dangerous, that it would make them disobedient, disrespectful, unwilling to marry. One afternoon, as she swept the floor, a man rode up to the school on horseback. His voice was harsh. "You're filling their heads with lies," he said. "A woman's place is not here." She didn't look up. Her hands kept sweeping. When he saw she wasn't going to answer, he spat on the ground and rode away. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of his words pressed on her like a weight. She thought of her daughter, of Amina, and wondered if her husband had found out where she was. She hadn't received any letters, but sometimes she dreamed of home. In her dreams, Amina was older, standing in the same classroom, her small hands covered in chalk dust. When she woke from those dreams, her heart ached with both hope and pain. Despite the threats, she didn't stop teaching. The next morning, she arrived early and opened the doors before anyone else. One by one, the girls came back, their steps quiet but determined. They didn't ask questions about the men outside or the angry whispers in the market. They just sat, waiting for the lesson to begin. That silent courage reminded her of why she had come here in the first place. Sometimes, between lessons, she told stories, not from books but from life. She told them about a girl who had been married to a man older than her father. She never said it was her own story, but the girls always listened closely, their eyes wide, their hands still. "Did she ever escape?" one of them asked once. She paused, her throat tightening, then smiled faintly. "She found a way," she said. "Not right away, but she did." The months turned into seasons and the school began to change. The walls were repaired, the benches repainted. A small garden grew outside, planted by the girls themselves, flowers and vegetables twisting toward the sun. People from neighboring villages started to visit, first out of curiosity, then out of respect. A few mothers began sending their daughters too, saying quietly that they wanted them to learn just a little. Then, one afternoon, as she was packing up her things, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the road. Her breath caught in her throat. The man was older now, his beard grayer, his shoulders heavier, but she recognized him instantly. Her husband. He stood still, watching her for a long moment before walking toward her. She felt her heart pounding, her palms damp. She didn't know if he had come for revenge or something else. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she remembered. "You've changed," he said. She said nothing. The silence between them was thick with years of things unsaid. "I thought you died," he continued. "Then I heard about this place. They said there's a woman here teaching girls, making them strong. I didn't believe it at first." She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Why are you here?" she asked. He looked past her at the sound of laughter coming from inside the school. "Amina," he said softly. "She's grown, she's asking questions. She doesn't listen to me the way she used to." He paused, then added, "She wants to come here." Her breath caught. She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time in years. There was no anger there, no pride, just weariness. "She's your daughter," he said. "If you want to teach her, you can." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his boots stirring up dust with each step. She stood frozen, the world around her fading into silence. Amina. The name felt like sunlight on her skin. The next morning she waited by the school door before dawn, unable to stay still. As the sun rose, she saw a small figure walking down the road, thin, graceful, with long hair braided neatly down her back. When Amina reached the doorway, she looked up and smiled. "Mama!" The word broke her completely. She dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly as tears filled her eyes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The world outside the school disappeared. It was only the two of them, the mother who had fought for freedom, and the daughter who would learn what it truly meant. From that day, Amina sat in the front row of the class. She learned faster than anyone, her curiosity endless. And every time her mother picked up a piece of chalk, she felt something rise inside her, not just pride, but peace. The life she had been forced into had taken so much from her. But now, through her daughter and these girls, she was taking it all back, piece by piece, word by word, day after day. The days that followed were brighter than any she could remember. Each morning, the first sound she heard was her daughter's laughter echoing through the small schoolhouse. It was light, sharp, and free, like birdsong carried by the wind. Amina filled the place with energy. She wasn't afraid to ask questions, to speak loudly, to challenge ideas that even adults hesitated to mention. The younger girls adored her. They copied her handwriting, repeated her words, and followed her around like little shadows. For the woman who had once been silenced by the weight of obedience, watching her daughter speak without fear was like breathing for the first time. The two of them fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. In the mornings they walked to school together, Amina skipping ahead, hair shining under the sun. The road was dusty, lined with wildflowers, and every step felt like a small miracle. In class, she sat at the front, always eager, always learning. And when the lessons ended, she would stay behind to help sweep the floor or water the garden. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would take a stick and trace letters into the dirt outside, whispering the words her mother had taught her as if committing them to memory. But not everyone celebrated this new beginning. Word spread quickly through nearby villages, stories of the woman who had defied her husband and the child who now followed in her footsteps. Some men called her dangerous. Others said she was corrupting their daughters. One evening, as she locked the school door, she found a small rock lying by the entrance. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper with rough handwriting. "Stay quiet or we will make you." Her hands trembled as she read it, but when she looked around, the road was empty. The air felt heavy, the shadows long. For a brief moment the old fear returned, the kind that froze her bones, that whispered she was still powerless. But then she heard Amina calling her name from inside, her voice bright and impatient. The fear broke like glass. She pocketed the note and walked back inside. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the moon spilling silver light across the floor. She thought about her life, the girl she had been, the woman she became, the mother she was now. Every step had been painful, every choice costly. But here she was, still standing, still breathing, still teaching. She smiled faintly and whispered into the night, "I will not go back." The next morning she arrived at the school early. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of wet earth after the rain. She placed the threatening note in a small tin box under her desk, as if burying it with all the other fears she had once carried. When the girls arrived, she noticed their smiles were brighter than usual. One of them carried a bunch of wildflowers for her. Another held a small book she had borrowed from the traveling merchant who sometimes passed through. Life in its quiet way kept moving forward. Weeks passed. The girls grew bolder. They began reading aloud in the market, helping younger children write their names, sharing what they learned with others. The change was slow, invisible at first, but it spread like roots beneath the soil, reaching deeper with each passing day. Mothers began to visit the school too. Some brought food, others just sat by the doorway, listening as their daughters recited the alphabet. One woman cried softly, whispering that she wished someone had taught her the same when she was young. Amina's presence became a symbol of what was possible. Her confidence inspired others, but it also drew attention. One afternoon, a man arrived at the school, one of the same elders who had once tried to shut it down. He stood in the doorway, his voice sharp. "You're filling these girls with ideas that don't belong to them," he said. "You're teaching them to be like men." She looked at him calmly. "I'm teaching them to be like themselves," she said. The man's face tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. When he was gone, the girls looked at her with wide eyes. She smiled, though her hands were shaking. "Keep reading," she said softly. "Don't ever stop." That night, as she and Amina walked home under the fading light, they found the same man's wife waiting at the path. She held a small bundle of food and offered it to them quietly. "He doesn't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "But I do. Keep doing what you're doing." Then she turned and hurried away before anyone could see her. It was moments like that, small, unspoken gestures, that reminded her why she could never stop. She began keeping a journal, scribbling by candlelight after Amina fell asleep. She wrote about her students, about the lessons they learned, about the way their laughter made her believe the world could still change. She didn't know if anyone would ever read her words, but writing them felt like reclaiming every voice that had ever been silenced. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. A group of men from the village came to the school not to protest, but to talk. They said they wanted to build another classroom, maybe even start lessons for boys too. The news spread fast. Some called it progress, others called it luck. But deep down, she knew what it truly was, the result of every small act of defiance, every word spoken when silence was demanded. As months turned into years, the school grew. Amina became a young woman, her mind sharp, her heart kind. She began teaching alongside her mother, guiding the younger girls with patience and strength. Sometimes, when they stood side by side at the front of the classroom, the older woman would glance at her daughter and feel her chest tighten, not with sadness, but pride so deep it hurt. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the students had gone home, Amina sat on the porch, her face turned toward the horizon. "Mama," she said softly, "do you ever wish things had been different for you?" The woman thought for a long time before answering. "If they had been," she said, "you might never have been born, and these girls might never have learned to read. So maybe things happened the only way they could." Amina reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. The woman looked out at the glowing sky, orange fading to purple, and felt a strange peace settle inside her. There had been pain, yes. There had been loss. But there was also this: a new generation of girls laughing freely, learning without fear, walking roads that she had once only dreamed of. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened to their distant voices, the sound like music against the twilight air. And for the first time in her life, she realized that the story she once thought was about her suffering had quietly become something else entirely. A story about strength, love, and everything that had finally begun to grow from it.